In the description below, I have a zip file right off the bat. And in it, on the very last book, you'll see that I've combined the four Gospels together so it reads in order. And what I've done is put the verse where it come from before you read that verse. And I've done over 200 videos how I clean the text up to get to the story as truthful as I can. This video is going to be about the false teaching again by Robert Barron, and it was his sermon on where heaven and earth meet. And what he's going to do is he's going to start out saying that this is a one of 5 sermons that they're going to give over the next 5 weeks. And it's about how this text needs a institutional narrative. By that is, if you listen to all of it and understand some of the background, and that is the church fathers, 2,000 years ago, they went and said, we're not going to teach from the text itself. We're going to say these verses mean this, and that's what's missing, he's going to say, in the words that they wrote, supposedly John wrote, in the text, and that's the institutional narrative.
Peace be with you. Friends, during the V cycle of readings for the liturgical year, we always have this section during the summertime. We read, I think it's for 5 weeks, from the 6th chapter of John's Gospel, which is all about the Eucharist. Now, here's the interesting thing, everybody. In John's Gospel, there's an account of the Last Supper, but there's no mention in that account of what we call the institution narrative. That means the little recounting of what Jesus did with the bread and the wine and so on, which you find in the Synoptic Gospels. John has the account of the Last Supper, but we find there the washing of the feet of the disciples, and then we have this long discourse by Jesus, but no institution narrative. People have been sometimes puzzled. Well, why would that be missing in John, which is the most mystical of the 4 Gospels? Well, here's a short answer. It's missing there only because in the 6th chapter of John, we have a deeply and intensely Eucharistic theology. John develops his Eucharistic theology in this chapter 6. Can I recommend to you, everybody, take out your Bibles and just open to John chapter 6. Read the whole thing. It's not that long.
Okay, now you heard it's this teaching that needs to be in the text and not just go by the story and to interpret. And I'm going to interpret it from the text. Okay, so, but that's what you just learned was John is the most mystical. I don't know why you need to tie paganism to Jesus's teachings or in the 4 Gospels, but that's his words. Now, what they are doing with the bread and wine, they are reenacting the last dinner Jesus had with his disciples, and it's about the eating of the bread and wine. Yet the teaching isn't going to be talked about in this one. That's going to come up later. So I guess this first teaching is going to talk about how Jesus is being followed by a crowd, and he's going to feed the multiple of people. Me, I call that a miracle. He doesn't compare that as a miracle. But this is how he's going to compare the Mass as to coming to the priest is like coming to Jesus, which I don't know if that's truly what Catholics believe, but this is what he's going to say. Now, I want to talk about something here that's going to come up in this, and that's the word mountain. Now, I'm a stickler for using the exact words what they should be. And the word mountain is listed, I think, 350 sometimes, and 320 of them say that there's mountains in Israel. And I would just want to show you here on these topographical maps, you can see that these reddish things are higher than anything that's in Israel here. Here's a side view of it. In fact, Moses spoke from up above, or Moses was sent by a creator to overlook Israel and show him the promised land, and it was called hilly country. But the editors that's rewriting the text have put the word mountain in there, and you're just being deceived by that. It's every word you say is going to be judged, okay? So you have to really watch what you're saying. I guess I'll get to the part here and let it run here.
Very interesting now how it commences. Jesus will get into a lengthy discourse about the Eucharist, but it begins narratively. What's being narrated here is this familiar story of the multiplication of the loaves, but what's really symbolically being narrated is the Mass, We're not going to get the Eucharist apart from the Mass, outside the context of the Mass. And so John lays it out now, not denying for a minute that this miracle really happened. I mean, it was so deeply ingrained in the memories of the first Christians, but he presents it in this sort of iconic way that brings out the different dimensions of the Mass. So this is now the very beginning, the opening verses of John chapter 6. So a large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now look at these elements, first of all. You've got a large crowd following Jesus. Why do we come to Mass? There might be saints coming to Mass. There might be someone just at the very beginning of the spiritual life, just a seeker. But everyone that comes to Mass is coming because they sense in him the answer. They sense he's the shepherd. They're magnetically drawn to him. So think of the crowd now coming to Jesus like the crowd gathering for Mass on Sunday.
Okay, so what you just said, what is Jesus is going to do about feeding the multiples of people, it is what they do, the priest does for the Mass, okay, for the people that are there. Now, he did say that Jesus had followers because he made signs on the sick, okay? Well, that's really a false teaching. They were waiting for their king from David's time so they could enter into heaven and live in his kingdom forever away from their enemies. They believe Jesus is their king in heaven, and not that he made signs on the sick. Jesus never made signs. He might have laid his hand on them sometimes. He did say it a few times, just said it in the text. But they had witnessed Jesus healing people. Now, this was done by their prophets of old, and they hadn't seen that themselves. So they were saying that we know prophets were with our Creator. He talked to them, and then they came out and told us what our Creator said or were to obey. So it was, they now would have believed Jesus more as their king, okay? But this guy, he doesn't care how to tell you the truth. And I'm going to play that clip again. And I want you to watch for him to smirk here, because at this point, you've got to really listen to him, because he's going to say that the comparing of the Mass, he is like Jesus or whoever's at the, is teaching from the church, from the pulpit, I guess, or whatever. And he has the answers, this institutional narrative. And that's, we'll watch for that institutional narrative play out here.
So a large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now look at these elements, first of all. You've got a large crowd following Jesus. Why do we come to Mass? There might be saints coming to Mass. There might be someone just at the very beginning of the spiritual life, just a seeker. But everyone that comes to Mass is coming because they sense in him the answer. They sense he's the shepherd. They're magnetically drawn to him. So think of the crowd now coming to Jesus like the crowd gathering for Mass on Sunday.
Okay. Now, again, he is trying to tell you that he, as teacher, and that's when he smirks. And you got to listen to that because he's talking about himself in a third person by saying him. He doesn't directly say from me. This is like a deceivement that he's not saying what you would normally say. So I'll just let that play a little bit here.
There might be saints coming to Mass. There might be someone just at the very beginning of the spiritual life, just a seeker. But everyone that comes to Mass is coming because they sense in him the answer. They sense he's the shepherd. They're magnetically drawn to him. So think of the crowd now coming to Jesus like the crowd gathering for Mass on Sunday.
Okay, you heard it. Okay, now after this next clip, he's going to say that the church is the privileged meeting place for heaven and earth, and yet you should individually be talking to our Creator. A prayer means to pray, it means to, whether you're talking to our Creator with your hands straight out or whether you're kneeling, that's pray. Prayer is the words that you're talking to our Creator. If you're going to ask our Creator for something, that is known as a petition or a supplication in the Hebrew text. So, but the thing here is that's where the really privileged heaven and earth can be found. You don't have to go to church to find this meeting place or privileged meeting place, because they're going to give you the institutional narrative and going to replace Jesus and say, this is what actually Jesus meant by giving you his body and his blood. So let's see here. I want you to listen to the disciples tell Jesus, the cost of the feeding of them. There's going to be this conversation of Jesus will talk about, or no, Philip, I think, will tell Jesus that we don't have enough money. He's going to use the words wages for food. Now, I just wanted you to make sure you're ready for the next part here.
The Mass is the privileged meeting place of heaven and earth. The crowd comes to him and they go up the mountain. And listen, and there he sat down with his disciples. Jesus raised his eyes and saw a large crowd coming to him. He said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" It says he was just testing him. He knew, of course. And then Philip says, well, 200 wages of food would not be enough to give each of these people even a little.
Wages for food. Now, I keep, just saying that you use words falsely. You're going to be judged by every word you say. So the thing here is you've got to understand this. He just doesn't care how he says these words, because let me show you the text itself here. I use the New American Standard 1977 because I have a Bible program that has the concordance, so I can look up other words to help me out. But John 6, this is when they're talking about when Jesus went away, or when Jesus went to the other side of this Lake Galilee or Tiberias. Now, this means that if you put the text correctly in order, which I did, you'd find out that Jesus had just met with the guy that had the legion of demons, and then they wanted him to leave. So they got back in the boat, and now they're all the way on the other side. Yet the text, when you see what I've done, there's other parts of the story that's in there. And it's the part that when Jesus talks about something about the bread, either the disciples brought it up or Jesus brought it up, but the disciples ended up saying, we forgot to get bread. And Jesus reminds them and says, no, I am your bread. My words are what you need to enter into heaven. So you have to exist on my words, okay, and trust me to enter into my kingdom in heaven. But that's what's missing here. So what now is they've already landed, and the text does say they were seeing signs. This word signs is absolutely not truthful. And then you can see went up the mountain. That couldn't happen because we know that the story later, let's see here, down here, right here, where the lad had 5 loaves and 2 fish. So the thing here is this guy had to be around close enough to them to hear them talking, Jesus talking, that the crowd might be hungry. So let's sit down and rest. And then the little boy might have come over and just got done shopping because it's along the seashore and maybe inside a little bit, but the city, he might have went through the city and the boy was following along, but it means he couldn't have went up a mountain. It means along a road, and there would have been a field for everybody to sit down, but there had to be a place where Jesus was standing and not sitting a little bit higher so everybody could see him, or as it says, so he could see everybody. And then the little boy would have to say, hey, I've got these. But the only thing is the when he's talking to Philip about where will we buy bread, Philip answers him and saying 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, not even to receive a little bit. In other words, he said the money that if we went out and bought it, not wages of food. That you get paid for the work you did, okay? You bought other things. It wasn't wages for food. So I'm going to play that again to show. I think I'm going to play that again for you. But again, every word you say, you're going to be judged, especially if you're talking about Jesus and our Creator. These false words that he's using just are being said wrong for trickery. So the thing here is I'm going to get, let me see. Oh yeah, remember here that having given thanks, Jesus took the loaves and having given thanks. And that means that he must have asked our Creator to for the miracle to break up the fish and the bread. So the thing here is then having given thanks to our Creator for this. Okay, that's the way I would say the story would have to occur. So now let's hear again what's being said.
Jesus raised his eyes and saw a large crowd coming to him. He said to Philip, where can we buy enough food for them to eat? Says he was just testing him. He knew, of course. And then Philip says, well, 200 wages of food would not be enough to give each of these people even a little.
You notice that he turned the page, so he is reading what he's been told to read in English since 1611, being taught all around the world in English. Those that churches are in English-speaking cities. That's what he's reading. It's in their text to distort the words. So I just want to let you know that and make sure that you understand that. Now, what he's going to do is start talking about that what gifts you bring to Jesus, bread, fish, and water. And then 30 seconds later, he's going to say the Christ is going to elevate and transform the bread and fish. Not that it's a miracle. And the title Christ shouldn't be used at this time, okay? But I want you to hear this, how he's saying this.
And then Andrew, well, there is this little kid here, and he's got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Jesus said, have them recline and give them to me. So following the liturgy of the word, we have the creed, which is interesting because the creed is not just an abstract formal statement. It's the people's way of saying, I believe in what I've just heard. See, because the creed sort of lays out the basic narrative of salvation. So in saying that, amen to the creed, we're saying amen to what we just heard. Then gifts are brought forward, aren't they? A little bread, a little wine, a little bit of water. If we're talking about feeding people's physical hunger, I mean, that little wafer that you give one to each person, it would barely address their hunger. You see, we're just like Philip and Andrew. I mean, there's this giant crowd to feed, but what do we have here but a few little morsels, a few little items? Jesus says, well, give them to me. What happens at Mass is these tiny elements come forward. The crowd is marked by the deepest kind of spiritual hunger. And you think, well, what good will this do, these little gifts that we give? But if you give them to Christ, what happens? They come back elevated and transformed unto the feeding of that whole crowd. So there's a physical miracle being described here, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. What happens at Mass is something.
Okay. Jesus is going to elevate it and transform it. At that time, it wasn't a miracle. At that time, he just got done saying Jesus elevated and transformed it. And then it's this, that we can give to Christ something he does not need, and he will return that gift. I don't know what gifts you bring in to that you're there at the Mass and you're going to hand over to our Creator, because I don't know if he's showing up there for you, that you're going to hand these over to him. Now, I'm getting a little sarcastic there, but that's, you can't do that, okay? You just can't do that. Like I said, you can pray and talk to our Creator. That's the most important thing. The other thing is then to learn to obey the statutes, the commandments, and then the laws and then guidances that our Creator and Jesus both give us. But what's going to happen here coming up is that he's going to say that what the priest does is even more staggering than what Jesus did feeding the crowd. And that was news to me. So that's what's happening at Mass that is staggering. So I'm going to play this clip and let you hear this, how staggering they're going to teach what Jesus taught, or how Jesus fed them.
The crowd is marked by the deepest kind of spiritual hunger. And you think, well, what good will this do, these little gifts that we give? But if you give them to Christ, what happens? They come back elevated and transformed unto the feeding of that whole crowd. So there's a physical miracle being described here, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. What happens at Mass is something really even more staggering, because it's a miracle at the spiritual level. Christ doesn't need these little gifts that we offer. He doesn't need anything. God needs nothing. God makes the whole world ex nihilo, from nothing. Therefore, God doesn't need anything in the world. We can't give God something he doesn't already have. But when we give to God what he doesn't need, he can return that gift elevated and transfigured for us.
So you actually know what he doesn't need, but you give it to him. I don't know. Anyways, it's this priest is going to wave his hand, say a few words, and this causes the Jesus power to transubstantiate this into Jesus's body and blood. That's what's so staggering that he's going to be talking about here. Yet it's when he got out of the boat, when he wait a second. When Jesus got into the boat, when he was coming back from the guy with the legion of demons, that it was that conversation about bread. Now, he was specifically saying about the bread is that those speaking for Jesus, like what he's in deceiving, they are the false teachers. It's you are supposed to listen to what Jesus says or read what Jesus says, and then you are supposed to act on those words, not to go in there and he's going to transubstantiate Jesus' blood and our body and blood, and you're going to partake in Jesus' body and blood. That isn't what happened. That's never happened. But this is their teaching and how they want to teach it from John. Okay. Now, I believe at their last dinner, Jesus was trying to teach them again that his body is pretty much the physical that you see, and everything that he's taught you is our bread today. Okay. And it was going to be his blood, meaning that he was going to die, and they were going to be witnesses about this. And then they are to go out and teach later. But the object is that's more in line with what Jesus would have been saying at the last dinner, because he was discussing right after it how he's going to be betrayed. So I'm going to let you listen to it, and it's going to kind of have like a little skip, and then it's going to go to another part, but I'm just going to let it run.
He can return that gift elevated and transfigured for us. That's a basic biblical principle, basic gospel principle. Take the little you have, give it to him. It'll be elevated, transfigured unto the feeding of the world. So what happens at Mass? Not the physical multiplication of these little hosts, something much more marvelous. What happens is the transubstantiation of these elements. This ordinary bread drawn from the earth and from human labor, this ordinary wine drawn from grape and vine and human labor, become, through the power of Christ, transubstantiated into his body and his blood. The feeding of the crowd, the physical feeding of the crowd, is emblematic, therefore, everybody, of the feeding of the soul that takes place at Mass. We go up the mountain, we sit and listen to the word, then we bring the little that we have, and then we find it elevated for the transformation and feeding of the whole world. That's where we are at what we call the liturgy of the Eucharist. You know, it is wonderful. I skipped the line where Jesus takes these elements and he gives thanks. What do we call the prayer by which these elements are transfigured? But the Eucharistic prayer. Eucharistein in Greek just means to give thanks. The priest or the bishop is operating, we say, in persona Christi, in the very person of Christ. So, everybody, as we commence this about 5-week-long meditation upon the Eucharist, we start with the Mass. It's in the context of the Mass that the Eucharist makes sense. And let's keep our eyes and souls and minds open these next several weeks as we explore the mystery of this greatest of sacraments. And God bless you. This ordinary bread drawn from the earth and from human labor, this ordinary wine drawn from grape and vine and human labor, become, through the power of Christ, transubstantiated into his body and his blood. Yeah, I skipped the line where Jesus takes these elements and he gives thanks. What do we call the prayer by which these elements are transfigured? But the Eucharistic prayer. Eucharistein in Greek just means to give thanks. The priest or the bishop is operating, we say, in persona Christi, in the very person of Christ.
That's what's been going on since they started teaching the text in English. Now, I find it outrageous that he can sit there and deceive you right and left, and maybe you don't read the text as much as I do. So that's kind of why when you take a look at the 4 Gospels that I put together and you're reading it, there's still some that you have to interpret, but I've got the story in order because one of the stories about Jesus feeding the multitude at that time, they referred it to like when our Creator gave them manna in the Sinai. So the thing here is there are a lot of words that he just skips over because it's in a different book. You don't need to pay attention to that text. Well, I put it all together in order, and what I'll do is I'll take your belief to a trust by teaching the true truths about Jesus and our Creator, and I will see you on the next video next Sunday. I'll get it out for you. Other than that, talk to you later.